name is Sujata Warrior. I am the director for the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence on leave right now, and currently the country director for Bangladesh for the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative. And you're wondering what I'm doing here. Half of me is here, half of me is there, so, but I'm here. With me, I have at the panel here three very esteemed colleagues. So I'm going to start with the extreme left. We have Leela Abulugod, who is yes, who is the Joseph L. Buttenweiser Professor of Social Science at Columbia University and co-director for the Center for the Critical Analysis of Social Difference. The rest of her bio is there, and I'm not going to read it. I'm assuming if you're here, you can read. So I don't want to sort of belabor, because I would rather that we hear from them and engage in a dialogue rather than read their lengthy bios. Next to her is Esther Heinemann from Women to Women, Women for Afghan Women, and who spent most of her professional life teaching English and American literature, but really is now working very directly with women's issues at the local level. And to my left and to Esther's right is Gail Lemon, who is a journalist that has covered 10 years of presidential politics with ABC News, and this week with George Stephanopoulos. She's also done a lot of work at the local level, especially looking at women and entrepreneurs in conflict zones. So the way this panel is going to be structured is each of the panelists will speak from about 5 to 10 minutes, and I am going to monitor, and I will cut them off if that's necessary. And I have no trouble with them because they can go for therapy at the end of it, if that bothers them a lot. But so that, we really want to do is sort of ask a few questions for them. They'll ask a few questions, and really to have a dialogue with all of you, because the main issues for this panel are, like, what's the relationship between violence against women and culture? And how do various issues really intersect to provide the structures that make life difficult for women? And what are some of the strategies that we know work or don't work from different parts of the world? And how do we really bring about change in the issue? The other question that has also come up, because it's kind of, there are researchers here. How many of you are researchers? Just a quick show of hands so that we all know, okay? How many of you are activists? How many of you are sort of government policy people? No, oh, 1, 2. Others, miscellaneous, whatever, okay. Not that you mean others in that sense, but something that I haven't classified. And then what we really want to do is really open, because really to focus on how can activists really build good partnership with researchers, because both have a lot to offer. And oftentimes they work at cross purposes, which in the end does not really work for women on the ground, right? So that's also one of the advocacy strategies we're going to sort of think about. So put on your thinking caps, and then we'll give enough time for you to ask questions. So Leela, would you like to start?
Okay. So do you mind if I?
No problem.
Just stand somehow.
Okay. Okay. Okay, here.
No, I won't.
Here.
That's fine. Yeah, boy. Is this working? No.
Yeah.
It is? Oh, great. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. And I was going to say, it's kind of amazing that you're all here, given that the World Cup is on right now. My family was going, what, you're going to a conference when this is on? But I wanted to speak from my perspective as an anthropologist, not an activist, who's been studying and working with women in the Arab world for nearly 30 years, but who for the last decade or so has been observing with some alarm the international circulation of talk about Muslim women's rights and the many international activities that have accompanied or been justified by this talk about their rights or lack thereof. And I've been looking closely at what I see as a kind of strangely hysterical obsession with Muslim women as victims of their culture, their traditions, or their religion. And I've been especially worried about us as feminists and what we do to contribute to such representations and to the projects that are set up in the name of these representations that don't focus on changing structures of global inequality and violence that are the fundamental conditions of these women's vulnerabilities. And what I learned when I learned that this panel that I'd been put on was called Cultures of Violence, and that it brought together those of us who work on the Muslim world or in the Muslim world, I was concerned. Violence against women, as you know, violence in general is a very serious issue, and there are lots of ways to approach it. But to do something about it, and you've probably all know more than I do about this, we need good ways of analyzing its nature, its roots, and its distributions. And there are a lot of experts here at this conference, but I wanted to offer just one humble suggestion that might be surprising coming from an anthropologist, which is let's not talk about culture. I think culture acts as a screen to camouflage the more pressing and fundamental structures of violence affecting women in those parts of the world where we tend to blame culture. And I'll talk about this, how this applies in both war zones and to peaceful countries in the region. So here's the problem. Even though violence occurs in almost all communities, why, when we talk about cultures of violence, are we only talking about distant places? And as Letty Volpe, a law professor at Berkeley a long time ago, pointed out, one could easily talk about a frightening culture of violence in the US, where guns and knives are ubiquitous, where statistics prove that domestic violence occurs across class, race, and ethnicity, where every day the tabloid news, I think it might not be called tabloids in America, but gives us horrific stories of sex workers cut up into pieces, young women abducted and imprisoned in basements bearing the children of their rapists, incest, and so forth. But we never blame American culture or Judeo-Christian culture for these kinds of violence. We blame individuals, psychopaths, sometimes poverty, and some feminists do suggest that there's a culture of patriarchy that's to blame for this. But even they tend to presume, as Susan Moeller-Oken, the political theorist who wrote the famous article called "Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women?" They presume that we Americans or Europeans have progressed further in undoing this patriarchal culture. The cultural forms of violence against women are always associated with an elsewhere. So I think cultural arguments are actually dangerous, a dangerous way to go, and I think we have to be vigilant against them, and that's what I spend my time doing, because I think they're distributed unequally in the world as explanations for what we're seeing. And if I had to think of one culture to blame for the violence affecting women in the parts of the world we're talking about here in this panel, it would be that of armed conflict and militarism, which I know you've talked about in this conference, exemplified by invasions and occupations, like the US of Afghanistan and Iraq, and of Israel to Palestine. We don't normally call militarism culture or tradition. We don't relate it to Judaism or Christianity or Protestantism or whatever, though in these cases one could say that, but we don't. We call it politics. And we see that it's connected to economics and other things. And here's where I think we can intervene and we should intervene if we want to do something about serious violence against Muslim women. Now, my colleagues here on this panel who've been to Afghanistan, I think can talk a lot more than I can about what it's like to work in a context where the number of civilian deaths and injuries, so often women and girls, are due to the military presence, and especially American and NATO airstrikes are, no joke at all. In Iraq, we all know how dire the security situation is for women who had previously had safety, had jobs, had education, had positions in politics, and now don't dare walk the streets or find themselves in the millions as refugees with all the horrors and that entails. And I was just talking to a filmmaker who's been working on that. Now, I know a little bit more about Palestine. In my new study of women's rights work, I've been struck by just how consistent and interesting the Palestinian feminists have been in tracing the connections between forms of family violence and the larger political situation of harassment, arrest, imprisonment, and military violence, of humiliated men living in poverty, of besieged families living in fear and under inhuman conditions. Now, Palestinian women's NGOs point to the larger structural features that affect Palestinian women's lives without brushing under the carpet local family issues. Those scholar activists on the ground who assist international organizations are often dismayed to find, as Penny Johnson said in one article about this, that, quote, none of their analysis of violence of the occupation and siege and its effects on women and families get included in the final reports. And reports like the Human Rights Watch report on violence against Palestinian women and girls, it was called a question of security. She says, isolate domestic violence and implicitly gender relations and Palestinian families from all the contexts within which they function, unquote. And this report, for example, ignores the effects of the Israeli occupation on the Palestinian Authorities' ability to enforce laws that do exist, or on the effects of the pervasive violence and economic strangulation on family relations. And Professor Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian, I don't know, many of you may know her, who helped with this Human Rights Watch report, says in her new book, Militarization and Violence Against Women in Conflict Zones in the Middle East, that in conflict zones, we can really see how the personal is political and how there's no way to disengage home and front. But it's not only in conflict zones that I think local culture, tradition, or religion is a screen that camouflages the real structures of violence, which are global in nature. And I've just finished a chapter of a book I'm writing about, only the chapter's about this, about a case of domestic violence in a rural village in Egypt where I've been working for 15 years. And I found that the framework of women's rights as human rights, however we want to put it, was really inadequate for me in grasping the complex situation in which this one young woman I know has marital difficulties that sometimes erupt into violence. Her husband's violent when he drinks. Why does he drink? In a community where, Muslim community, where most people don't and it's considered wrong, because he's been part of the tourism industry and has mixed with foreigners since he was a young man in this very poor region of Egypt where there aren't really many other jobs except those in tourism. And he, like other local men, has also had a 20-year relationship with an older European woman who supports him. Global inequalities of wealth and the Western feminism that gave European women money and freedom to travel, these are critical forces in placing this young woman in a very difficult marriage. Another complication has to do with poverty. I mean, this one did too. She's a poor relation, and his marriage to her was meant as a kind of protection and a gift to her family. So there are bonds of attachment that keep her in the marriage. Also, she has 2 small kids now, and her family's too poor to support them or her if she decides to leave her husband. So she's stuck. And there's more. She herself came from a broken home and has been the victim of inadequate medical system. And with the collapse of the state medical system, with privatization and structural adjustment in Egypt, she hasn't been able to be helped with the problems she's had since she was a girl, despite her mother's constant efforts to find help for her. So we don't know what part mental illness plays in her relationship with her husband, but we do know that despite leaving her husband from time to time when he is violent, she chose a 3rd pregnancy. And other women in the village understand that she wants a family life, just like they do, even though this isn't always so easy to have or go so smoothly.